Play this, I'll give you $200 million. Khalil's voice cut through the penthouse like a blade, his eyes glittering with cold amusement as he gestured toward the silent Steinway. Any takers? The room erupted in laughter until the woman in the uniform began walking toward the piano. The city lights of Dubai painted golden patterns across the marble floor of the Al Rashid penthouse, their glow reflecting off every surface of the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased his kingdom below. Khalil al-Rashid stood at the center of his domain, a man sculpted by privilege and hardened by isolation. At 35, his tailored Italian suit couldn't disguise the hollow ache behind his calculating dark eyes, eyes that had learned early that money was armor, power was protection, and vulnerability was weakness. He surveyed his guests with the detached satisfaction of a collector admiring his acquisitions. Oil ministers, tech moguls, real estate titans, all gathered to celebrate another billion added to his empire. Yet as their laughter echoed through his penthouse, Khalil felt the familiar emptiness gnawing at his chest. Success had filled his bank accounts but left his soul barren. "Another triumph, my friend," said Hassan, his business partner, raising a glass of vintage champagne. "The Jakarta deal alone will net us—" "More money," Khalil interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of boredom that made Hassan's smile falter. "Always more money. Tell me, Hassan, when does it end?" Before Hassan could respond, Khalil's attention drifted to the Steinway grand piano positioned like a shrine in the corner, a $3 million instrument that had never been touched since his interior designer placed it there 2 years ago. It was a symbol, nothing more, beautiful, expensive, and utterly silent. That piano, Khalil mused aloud, his voice carrying across the room, cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. Yet it sits there, useless as art. 20 stories below, in the service quarters of the luxury building, Amelia Johnson folded the last of the silk table linens with practiced precision. Her movements were economical, graceful, the kind of efficiency born from years of making herself small and visible, indispensable. At 28, she carried herself with quiet dignity that her uniform couldn't diminish, though she'd learned to keep her eyes lowered, her voice soft, her dreams buried beneath layers of necessity. The call from the penthouse crackled through her radio. "Amelia, they need fresh champagne service upstairs, Mr. Al-Rashid's party." She smoothed her black dress, adjusted her white apron, and checked her reflection in the service elevator's polished doors. The woman staring back at her had intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, hands that remembered Mozart's sonatas even as they polished silver, and a voice that once filled concert halls but now whispered "Yes sir" and "Right away ma'am." The elevator climbed toward the penthouse, and with each floor, Amelia felt the familiar weight of invisibility settling over her shoulders. She was 28 years old, held a master's degree from Juilliard, and had once been called a prodigy. Now she was simply the help. But bills needed paying. Her mother's medical treatments weren't covered by insurance, and dreams, she'd learned, didn't put food on the table or keep the lights on. The elevator doors opened to reveal a world of marble and gold, of men in $1,000 suits discussing billions like pocket change. Amelia stepped into the penthouse with the silent grace of someone who had perfected the art of being present yet unseen. As she moved through the crowd, refilling glasses and clearing plates, fragments of conversation drifted around her. "Bought the entire block in Manhattan. My yacht's being upgraded with a helipad. The merger will crush our competitors. Money, power, conquest." The same conversations she'd heard in dozens of penthouses across the city, but tonight felt different. Tonight there was a restlessness in the air, a tension she couldn't quite identify. Near the piano, Khalil's voice rose above the others. "You know what amuses me? All this talk of culture, of art, of sophistication. Yet none of you Philistines could tell a Chopin from a nursery rhyme." Amelia's hands stilled on a champagne flute. Something in his tone made her look up, made her forget the first rule of service: remain invisible. Khalil continued, warming to his theme, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who had never been denied anything. That piano there, $3 million of the finest craftsmanship, silent as a gravestone because none of you possess an ounce of actual talent. Can you play, Khalil? Someone called out. His laugh was sharp, bitter. I can buy pianists. I can own orchestras. I can purchase entire opera houses, but play, that's for people who need to work for their supper. The crowd chuckled at his wit, but Amelia felt something crack inside her chest. She'd spent years biting her tongue, swallowing her pride, accepting that her worth was measured in how well she could disappear. But tonight, as Khalil's words dripped with contempt for the very art that had once been her lifeblood, something ancient and powerful stirred within her. She thought of her grandmother's weathered hands guiding her fingers across their old upright piano, of her mother's proud tears at her Juilliard graduation, of the dreams she'd sacrificed on the altar of survival. The champagne flute trembled in her hand. Khalil's voice cut through her memories. I'll tell you what, I'm feeling generous tonight. Anyone here who can play something, anything that moves me to actual emotion, I'll write them a check for $200 million. The room erupted in laughter. It was absurd, impossible, the kind of casual arrogance only infinite wealth could afford. 200 million, Hassan laughed. Khalil, you've had too much champagne. I'm completely serious, Khalil replied, his eyes glittering with cold amusement. $200 million for anyone who can make me feel something real through that beautiful, expensive piece of furniture. Any takers? The laughter continued, but underneath it, Amelia heard something else, the hollow echo of a man so disconnected from his own humanity that he had to bet fortunes to feel alive. She set down the champagne flute with deliberate care, her decision crystallizing like ice in her chest. She thought of her mother dying slowly in a hospital bed because they couldn't afford the experimental treatment. She thought of her own dreams, buried but not dead. She thought of every time she'd been dismissed, overlooked, reduced to uniform and expectation. Most of all, she thought of the piano, that beautiful silent Steinway that had been waiting for someone to wake it from its golden slumber. The crowd's attention was still focused on Khalil and his absurd challenge when Amelia began moving toward the piano. Her footsteps were soft on the marble floor, but something in her posture had changed. The careful invisibility was melting away, replaced by something more dangerous, purpose. She was 3 steps from the piano when Khalil noticed her approach. What do you think drives someone to hide their greatest gift? Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're loving this story already, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. The penthouse fell into an unnatural quiet as Amelia approached the Steinway, her reflection multiplying across its polished ebony surface like fragments of possibility. Khalil's champagne glass paused halfway to his lips, his predatory smile freezing as he registered her movement. The woman in the uniform, the help, was walking toward his $3 million trophy with the measured steps of someone approaching an altar. Excuse me, Khalil's voice cut through the silence, sharp as broken crystal. What exactly do you think you're doing? Amelia's fingers traced the piano's edge, and for a moment, the years collapsed. She was 8 again, standing on tiptoes to reach the keys while her grandmother's voice whispered, "Music is prayer made audible, child. It's the language God gave us when words aren't enough." "I'm accepting your challenge," she said quietly, not looking at him. Her voice carried a new quality, not the deferential whisper of the Maid, but something deeper, richer, something that made several guests turn their heads. Khalil's laugh was immediate, harsh. You're going to play piano? For $200 million? The disbelief in his voice was acid, eating through the careful politeness that usually governed such gatherings. Do you have any idea what you're doing? This isn't some pub piano where you bang out happy birthdays for tips. The crowd began to murmur, a mixture of amusement and second-hand embarrassment rippling through the room. Hassan stepped closer to Khalil, whispering urgently, "Maybe we should—" "No," Khalil said, his eyes never leaving Amelia. There was something predatory in his gaze now, the look of a man who had found fresh prey. "No, let her make a fool of herself. Let the help entertain us with her talents." Amelia's hands found the piano bench, and she pulled it out with reverent care. The sound of wood against marble seemed to echo through the entire penthouse. She sat down slowly, her posture transforming as her spine straightened, as her hands found their natural position above the keys. "What's your name?" Khalil asked, moving closer. His voice carried casual cruelty, the tone of a man about to witness entertainment at someone else's expense. "Amelia," she said, her fingers hovering just above the keys. She could feel the potential in them, 88 keys waiting to become language, waiting to become prayer. "Well, Amelia," Khalil drawled, "when you inevitably fail, and you will fail, I want you to remember that some things in life aren't for people like you. Some dreams are too expensive for the help to afford." The words hung in the air like poison. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. This was Khalil's kingdom, his rules, his cruelty. Amelia's hands stilled completely above the keys. For a heartbeat, the entire penthouse held its breath. Then, without looking at him, she spoke. "Mr. Al-Rashid, have you ever lost someone you loved more than your own heartbeat?" The question landed like a physical blow. Khalil's champagne glass finally completed its journey to his lips, but he didn't drink. Something in her voice, the quiet certainty, the underlying pain, had caught him off guard. "Have you ever held their hand while they slipped away, knowing that all your money, all your power, couldn't buy you one more moment with them?" Amelia's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room. "Have you ever stood at a graveside and realized that everything you thought mattered was just noise?" Khalil's hand tightened on his glass. Somewhere in the depths of his memory, a hospital room flickered, white walls beeping machines, and his mother's voice whispering his name before the silence that followed would shape the rest of his life. "Because that's what this is about to be," Amelia continued, her fingers finally gently touching the keys. "This is about love. This is about loss. This is about the only language that exists when everything else fails." She played a single note, middle C, pure, clear, perfect. The sound hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer. In that single note, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The casual cruelty evaporated, replaced by something more primal, anticipation. Then Amelia began to play. The melody that emerged wasn't Chopin or Mozart or any of the classical pieces the guests might have expected. Instead, it was something altogether different, a piece that seemed to pull itself from the air, from memory, from the deepest wells of human experience. Her fingers moved across the keys with the fluid grace of water finding its path, each note precisely placed yet flowing naturally into the next. The music was a conversation, not with the audience, but with something far more universal. It spoke of childhood lullabies that promised safety in an unsafe world, of first loves that burned bright and brief as shooting stars, of dreams deferred but never truly abandoned, of mothers who sacrificed everything for their children's futures. But underneath the beauty, there was something darker, more complex. The melody carried grief like an undercurrent, not overwhelming but present, honest, real. It was the sound of a heart that had been broken and carefully reassembled, stronger in the broken places. Khalil found himself stepping closer to the piano, his usual armor of cynicism cracking. The woman's hands, the help's hands, were moving with impossible grace, coaxing sounds from the Steinway that he had never imagined possible. This wasn't performance, this was confession. The melody swelled and Amelia's entire body became part of the music. Her shoulders moved with the rhythm, her head tilted toward the keys as if listening to secrets only she could hear. When she reached for the higher notes, her face lifted slightly, and Khalil caught a glimpse of something that stopped his breathing entirely. Her eyes were closed, but tears were streaming down her face. Not the theatrical tears of performance, but the honest grief of someone who had lived every note she was playing. The room had become a cathedral. 200 millionaires stood frozen, their conversations forgotten, their business deals and power plays reduced to background noise. Some had tears in their own eyes and couldn't have explained why. But it was Khalil who felt the music's full impact. Each note seemed to find the cracks in his carefully constructed defenses, seeping through like water through stone. The melody spoke to parts of himself he had spent decades trying to bury, the boy who had cried himself to sleep in boarding schools, the young man who had built walls so high he could no longer see over them, the billionaire who owned everything and belonged to no one. As Amelia's hands moved through a particularly complex passage, Khalil's champagne glass slipped from his nerveless fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, the sound incongruous against the flowing melody, but no one turned to look. The music had claimed them all. The piece was building now, growing more complex, more urgent. Amelia's fingers flew across the keys with impossible precision, and the Steinway responded like a living thing. The music filled every corner of the penthouse, spilled out onto the balcony, seemed to echo off the Dubai skyline itself. And then, just as the melody reached what seemed like its crescendo, Amelia did something that made Khalil's knees nearly buckle. She began to sing. Her voice was whiskey and honey, broken glass and silk. It rose above the piano's voice like a prayer ascending, wordless but somehow more articulate than any speech. The melody she sang wove around the piano's rhythm, creating harmonies that seemed to unlock chambers in the heart that most people didn't even know existed. Khalil gripped the back of a nearby chair, his knuckles white. He was 35 years old, worth $12 billion, commanded respect and fear in equal measure across 3 continents. But standing in his own penthouse, listening to his maid transform his silent trophy into living art, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: wonder. The music reached its true peak, not loud, but infinitely deep. Amelia's voice soared above the piano's foundation, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, every person in that room was connected to something larger than themselves. The artificial barriers of wealth and status crumbled under the weight of pure, honest emotion. Then, with a gentleness that was somehow more powerful than any crescendo, the music began to fade. Amelia's voice dropped to a whisper, then to silence. Her hands played the final notes with the tenderness of a mother tucking a child into bed. The last note hung in the air for what felt like forever. Then silence. Complete, profound, sacred silence. Amelia's hands remained poised above the keys, her head still bowed. Tears continued to trace down her cheeks, but her breathing was steady, peaceful. She had poured something essential of herself into that music, and the emptiness left behind wasn't hollow, it was clean, pure, ready to be filled with something new. Khalil stood frozen, his entire worldview cracking around him like ice in spring. This woman, this person he had dismissed, mocked, reduced to uniform and expectation, had just performed a miracle. She had taken his beautiful, expensive, silent trophy and transformed it into something transcendent. More than that, she had transformed him. For the first time in 20 years, Khalil al-Rashid felt something real. The silence stretched until someone, Hassan perhaps, or one of the oil ministers, began to applaud. But even the applause felt inadequate, too small for what they had just witnessed. Amelia finally looked up from the keys. Her eyes found Khalil's across the room, and in that gaze he saw something that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. He saw recognition, not the recognition of servant to master, but of one human being truly seeing another. "Your $200 million, she said quietly, her voice still carrying echoes of the song. "Do I win it?" But as Khalil stared at her, really looked at her for the first time, he realized she had already won something far more valuable than money. She had won his heart. The applause died away like ripples on a pond, leaving behind a silence that felt charged with electricity. Khalil stood motionless, his world tilted off its axis by 10 minutes of music that had somehow reached through decades of carefully constructed armor to touch something he'd forgotten existed. But as the immediate spell of the performance began to fade, his defenses slammed back into place like castle gates under siege. No. The word formed in his mind with crystalline clarity. This couldn't be happening. He was Khalil al-Rashid. He owned skyscrapers, commanded oil fields, moved markets with a phone call. He did not get undone by the help. He did not fall victim to sentiment. He did not allow himself to feel. Well, he said, his voice cutting through the lingering reverence in the room like a blade through silk. That was adequate. The word landed like a slap. Several guests flinched visibly. Hassan's mouth fell open in shock. But Khalil pressed on, desperation masquerading as cruelty. Adequate for a piano bar, perhaps, or a hotel lobby during afternoon tea. His laugh was sharp, brittle, but hardly worth $200 million. I said I wanted to feel something real, not sit through a community college recital. Amelia's hands, still resting on the keys, began to tremble. The peaceful afterglow of her performance flickered like a candle in a hurricane. She had poured her soul into that music, had offered up her most sacred gift, and he was dismissing it like a poorly prepared meal. "I see," she said quietly, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "What exactly would constitute real emotion for you, Mr. al-Rashid?" Khalil moved closer to the piano. His proximity meant to intimidate, but there was something desperate in his movement. Being near her felt dangerous, like standing too close to a fire that might consume him entirely. Real emotion? He leaned against the piano, his knuckles white as they gripped the polished surface. Real emotion is what moves markets. Real emotion is the fear in a competitor's eyes when I acquire their company. Real emotion is power, control, victory. His voice rose slightly, and several guests stepped back. Not some pretty sounds designed to make wealthy people feel cultured at dinner parties. "You're afraid," Amelia said simply. The words hit the room like a physical blow. No one spoke to Khalil al-Rashid that way. No one questioned him, challenged him, saw through him with such devastating clarity. "Excuse me?" His voice was dangerously quiet. Amelia slowly closed the piano lid, her movements deliberate and graceful. When she stood and turned to face him, something had shifted in her posture. The deferential maid was gone, replaced by someone who had nothing left to lose. "You're terrified," she continued, stepping away from the piano, "because for 10 minutes you felt something you couldn't buy, couldn't control, couldn't own. And that scares you more than any business deal ever could." The crowd watched in horrified fascination. This was better than any boardroom coup, more dramatic than any corporate takeover. The help was taking apart their host piece by piece, and he was letting her do it. "You think you know me?" Khalil's voice carried a warning that had made grown men reconsider their life choices. "You think because you can play a pretty song, you understand anything about my world?" "I think," Amelia said, gathering the purse she'd left on a nearby table, "that your world is very small for something that cost $12 billion to build." She started toward the service elevator, but Khalil's voice stopped her. "Where do you think you're going?" Amelia turned back, and for the first time that evening she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, it was the smile of someone who had just realized she was free. "Home, Mr. al-Rashid. To my small apartment with my sick mother and my invisible life. The life that apparently isn't real enough to move you. You can't just leave. You're working tonight. Fire me." The challenge hung in the air between them. Khalil's mouth opened, then closed. Firing her should have been effortless. He'd fired hundreds of employees for far less, but the words wouldn't come. That's what I thought, Amelia said softly. You can't fire me because then this conversation is over, and despite everything you just said, you don't want this conversation to be over. She was right, and they both knew it. The realization hit Khalil like a physical blow. He wanted her to stay, needed her to stay, but admitting that felt like admitting defeat, and Khalil al-Rashid had never been defeated by anyone. Hassan, he called sharply to his business partner, escort the staff out. The party is over. Khalil, we haven't finished discussing the Jakarta. The party is over. The dismissal was absolute. Guests began moving toward the elevator in uncomfortable silence, their evening's entertainment having taken a turn no one had anticipated. Within minutes the penthouse was empty except for Khalil and Amelia. The silence between them was different now, not the sacred quiet that had followed her performance, but something rawer, more dangerous. They stood on opposite sides of his marble kingdom, two people who had just shown each other truths they weren't ready to acknowledge. Why? Khalil asked finally, his voice barely audible. Why what? Why did you do it? Why did you play? You knew I would humiliate you. You knew I would. She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Amelia sat down heavily in one of his Italian leather chairs, suddenly looking exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance and its aftermath was fading, leaving behind the bone-deep weariness of someone who had just fought a battle she wasn't sure she'd won. Because you looked so alone, she said simply. The words hit Khalil like a punch to the chest. He turned away, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of his kingdom below. Dubai sparkled beneath them, a city built on ambition and oil and the dreams of men who believed they could reshape the world through sheer force of will. I am alone, he said to his reflection in the glass. That's how I prefer it. Is it? He could see her reflection behind his own in the window. She hadn't moved from the chair, but somehow her presence filled the entire room. The question hung between them, simple and devastating. Loneliness is a luxury, Khalil said, his voice harsh. Connection is weakness. Love is... What happened to you? Amelia interrupted gently. Khalil's hands pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. Somewhere far below, traffic moved like blood through arteries, carrying people home to families, to lovers, to lives that mattered to someone else. Nothing happened to me, he said. I became successful. I became powerful. I became everything a man is supposed to become. You became empty. He spun around, anger flashing in his eyes. Empty. I own 3 oil companies. I have homes on 4 continents. I employ 10,000 people. Presidents take my calls. I move billions of dollars with a signature. How is that empty? Amelia studied him with those intelligent eyes, and Khalil felt more exposed than he had in decades. She saw through his wealth, his power, his carefully constructed persona, straight to the core of him, and what she saw there wasn't impressive at all. When was the last time someone said your name with love instead of fear? She asked. The question hit its target with surgical precision. Khalil's mouth opened, but no answer came. He couldn't remember. The realization was so stark, so devastating that for a moment he couldn't breathe. Get out, he whispered. Mr. al-Rashid. Get out. His voice echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Get out before I have security remove you. Get out before I destroy what's left of your pathetic little life. Get out. Amelia flinched but didn't move. For a long moment she sat in his expensive chair, looking at him with something that might have been pity. Then slowly she stood. Your mother, she said quietly. The woman in the hospital room when you were 12. The one who held your hand while the machines beeped and the doctors whispered in the hallway. She said, your name with love. Khalil went perfectly still. The memory she had somehow pulled from the deepest vaults of his heart hung between them like a living thing. His mother's final moments, her weak voice calling him closer, her fingers squeezing his with the last of her strength. How could you possibly? Because that's what the music was about. Amelia said simply, loss, love, the moments that break us and make us human. She moved toward the elevator, then paused. She would be ashamed of what you've become. The elevator doors closed behind her, leaving Khalil alone in his kingdom of marble and gold, and crushing absolute silence. He stood there for a long time, surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing that mattered. Outside, Dubai glittered like a jewel, beautiful and cold and eternal. Inside, Khalil al-Rashid, billionaire, empire builder, king of his own hollow domain, finally understood what it meant to be poor. His hands were shaking when he reached for his phone. What do you think hurts more, being alone by choice, or discovering you're alone despite having everything? Drop your thoughts below. Sometimes the hardest truths come from unexpected places. The elevator descended through 20 floors of luxury, each floor marking Amelia's transition from the rarefied air of the penthouse back to the world where people like her belonged. By the time she reached the service level, her hands had stopped shaking, but the adrenaline crash was hitting her full force. What had she done? She'd just destroyed her job, her income, her mother's medical coverage, all for what? 10 minutes of music and the satisfaction of telling a billionaire the truth he didn't want to hear? The practical voice in her head, the one that had kept her fed and housed for the past 5 years, was screaming warnings she should have listened to hours ago. Her phone buzzed as she gathered her things from the staff locker. Her supervisor's name flashed on the screen. Amelia, we need to talk. Now. My office. 20 minutes later, she sat across from Mrs. Chen, the building's head of staff services, watching her career implode in real time. Mr. Al-Rashid has filed a formal complaint, Mrs. Chen said, her voice carefully neutral, insubordination, disruption of a private event, and, she glanced at her computer screen, psychological harassment. Amelia almost laughed. Psychological harassment? According to his account, you used personal information to deliberately cause him emotional distress. Mrs. Chen's fingers drummed against her desk. Amelia, in 15 years, I've never seen a complaint like this. What happened up there? I played piano. You played? Mrs. Chen stopped, shook her head. He wants you terminated immediately. No severance, no references. He's also threatening to have you blacklisted from every luxury service company in the city. The words hit like physical blows. Blacklisted meant no work, no income, no way to pay for her mother's treatments. It meant watching everything she'd sacrificed for crumble because she'd had 10 minutes of pride. However, Mrs. Chen continued, he also transferred $500,000 to the building's employee relief fund with specific instructions that it be used for emergency medical expenses for staff families. He requested no acknowledgement of the donation. Amelia's breath caught. $500,000, enough to cover her mother's experimental treatment with money to spare. It made no sense. Why would he destroy her career while simultaneously solving her biggest problem? I don't understand. Neither do I, Mrs. Chen admitted. But I have my orders. You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. She paused, studying Amelia's face. For what it's worth, in 15 years of managing staff for these people, I've never seen anyone walk away from a confrontation with Khalil al-Rashid on their own terms. Whatever you did up there, it got under his skin. 3 hours later, Amelia sat in her mother's hospital room, holding her hand while machines beeped in steady rhythm. The experimental treatment had been approved, funded by an anonymous donor. The doctors were optimistic. Her mother might live to see another Christmas, but Amelia felt hollow, unmoored. She'd won and lost simultaneously, and the contradiction was tearing her apart. Baby girl, her mother's weak voice drew her from her thoughts. You look like you've seen a ghost. Just tired, Mama. Tired from what? Playing piano again? Amelia's head snapped up. How did you? Her mother smiled, the expression transforming her gaunt face. Your hands. You've been playing again. I can always tell your fingers move differently for days after you touch the keys. They remember. Tears pricked Amelia's eyes. I lost my job. But you found your music. Mama, that's not we need the money. We need you to be who you are. Her mother interrupted gently. Not who you think you have to be to survive. There's a difference, baby girl. 23 floors above them, Khalil stood in his study, staring at the phone in his hand. He'd been holding it for 2 hours, Amelia's contact information glowing on the screen. The building's staff directory had provided her address, her employment history, even her emergency contact, her mother at Dubai General Hospital. He'd made the donation impulsively, a gesture he couldn't explain to himself. $500,000 was pocket change to him, but he knew it would change everything for her. It felt like penance, though for what sin he couldn't name. But the donation had created a new problem. Now he had her address. The smart thing would be to let her disappear into the city's vast anonymity. She was fired, blacklisted, removed from his world as effectively as if she'd never existed. The evening's disruption could be filed away as an aberration, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by too much champagne and too little sleep. But her words echoed in his mind like a song he couldn't shake. When was the last time someone said your name with love? His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Hassan's name appeared on the screen. Khalil, what the hell happened tonight? Nothing happened. A minor disruption with the staff. A minor disruption? Hassan's voice crackled with disbelief. I've had 6 calls from tonight's guests. They're all talking about the same thing, your maid playing piano like some kind of virtuoso. They want to know who she is, where she studied, if she gives private concerts. Khalil's grip tightened on the phone. Tell them she was nobody. A former employee with delusions of grandeur. Khalil? Hassan's voice gentled. I've known you for 15 years. I was there when your mother died. I've watched you build walls so high that sometimes I wonder if you remember what's on the other side of them. But tonight, for just a few minutes, I saw you look at that woman like she was the most important person in the world. The words hit too close to home. You're imagining things. Am I? Then why did you donate $500,000 to the Employee Relief Fund an hour after firing her? Khalil closed his eyes. Hassan was too smart, had known him too long. There was no hiding from someone who'd watched you become the man you never wanted to be. She's dangerous, Khalil said finally. How so? She makes me remember things I've spent 20 years trying to forget. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. For a moment neither man spoke. Maybe, Hassan said gently. Those are things worth remembering. After the call ended, Khalil found himself walking through his penthouse like a stranger in his own space. Everything looked different now. The marble floors seemed cold, the expensive art seemed lifeless, the Steinway in the corner seemed to pulse with possibility and accusation in equal measure. He'd had the piano tuned monthly for 2 years, but had never heard it sing until tonight. Now he couldn't escape the memory of Amelia's hands dancing across the keys, her voice rising above the melody like prayer made audible. At midnight, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. He was going to find her. Not to apologize, Khalil al-Rashid didn't apologize to anyone, not to offer her job back, that bridge was thoroughly burned, but to understand what she had done to him, what spell she had cast that made his $12 billion empire feel like an elaborate prison. The drive through Dubai's late-night streets felt surreal. His driver had raised an eyebrow when Khalil provided the address, a modest apartment complex in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of place his security team would have dismissed as beneath their concern. But Khalil had insisted on going alone. He stood outside her building at 12:47 a.m., looking up at the lit window on the 4th floor. Behind that window was a woman who had seen through his defenses as if they were made of glass, who had touched something in him he'd forgotten existed, who had made him feel more in 10 minutes than he had in 20 years. The smart thing would be to turn around, drive back to his penthouse, and pretend this night had never happened. Instead, Khalil al-Rashid, master of the universe, king of his own domain, pressed the buzzer for apartment 4B and waited to see if she would let him in. The intercom crackled to life. "Mr. al-Rashid?" Her voice was surprised but not shocked, as if she'd been expecting him. "May I come up?" A long pause, then "The elevator is broken. You'll have to take the stairs." The buzzer sounded, unlocking the building's front door. As Khalil climbed 4 flights of worn stairs, his Italian leather shoes echoing in the narrow stairwell, he wondered what exactly he thought he was doing. By the time he reached her door, he still didn't have an answer. But when Amelia opened it, still wearing the simple dress from earlier, but with her hair loose around her shoulders and her eyes bright with unshed tears, Khalil realized that for the first time in decades, he was exactly where he needed to be. "You came," she said simply. "I couldn't stay away," he admitted. And in that moment, standing in the doorway between her world and his, both of them understood that everything was about to change. Have you ever had someone enter your life who completely changed your perspective in a single moment? Share your story. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the most meaningful connections. Amelia's apartment was a universe away from Khalil's penthouse, small, worn, but filled with warmth that no amount of money could purchase. Books lined makeshift shelves, sheet music spilled from an old piano bench, and photographs covered every available surface like a gallery of love and loss. Khalil stood awkwardly in the doorway, his expensive suit incongruous against the backdrop of her modest life. He'd commanded boardrooms and owned palaces, but this tiny space, barely larger than his walk-in closet, somehow felt more real than anywhere he'd ever been. "Tea?" Amelia asked, moving toward a small kitchen that was separated from the living room by nothing more than a change in flooring. "I don't drink tea." "Coffee, then?" "I don't." He stopped himself. The truth was he hadn't made a simple beverage choice in years. Everything was brought to him, chosen for him, optimized for his schedule and preferences, by an army of assistants. "Tea is fine." As she prepared the tea with economical movements, Khalil found himself drawn to the photographs. They told the story of a life lived fully despite limited resources, a young Amelia at a piano recital, beaming with pride, the same girl older, in a graduation cap, standing next to a woman who shared her intelligent eyes, concert programs from venues he recognized, prestigious halls where only the most gifted performed. "Juilliard," he said, reading a diploma on the wall. "Full scholarship," Amelia replied without turning around. "They called me a prodigy. Said I had the hands of an angel and the heart of an old soul." "What happened?" The question hung in the air as Amelia poured hot water over tea bags in mismatched cups. Her movements slowed, became deliberate in the way that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. "Life happened," she said finally, turning to face him. "My father left when I was 16, just vanished one day, leaving Mama with medical bills from his failed business and a mountain of debt." She handed him the tea, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The scholarship covered tuition, but not living expenses, not medical bills, not reality. Khalil accepted the cup, surprised by its warmth against his palms. When was the last time someone had made him tea? When was the last time someone had made him anything? "So you gave up music?" "I gave up the dream of music," she corrected, settling into a worn armchair that had probably been expensive 20 years ago. "But you can't give up music itself. It lives in your bones, in your breathing, in the way you hear the world. I just found other ways to survive." She gestured to a corner of the room where an old upright piano stood against the wall. Its wood was scarred, keys slightly yellowed with age, but it had been maintained with obvious care. My grandmother's piano. Mama made sure we could keep it when we lost the house, said some things were worth more than money. Khalil studied the instrument. It was probably worth less than his watch, but something about it radiated more presence than his $3 million Steinway ever had. You've been playing all along. Mama's treatments are expensive, Amelia said quietly. I take whatever work I can find, weddings, hotel lounges, private parties, usually places where no one really listens to the music, where it's just background noise for other people's lives. The revelation hit Khalil like a physical blow. While he'd been accumulating wealth and power, dismissing artists and musicians as expendable luxuries, this woman had been pouring her soul into thankless gigs just to keep her mother alive. Tonight, he said carefully, tonight I played for someone who needed to hear it. Amelia interrupted. Not someone who wanted background music for their business deals or elevator atmosphere for their parties. Someone who needed to remember what it felt like to be human. Khalil set down his teacup with trembling hands. How did you know about my mother? Amelia was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to his core. Because you had the same look she probably did, she said gently. The look of someone who's forgotten how to let people love them. The words unlocked something in Khalil's chest, a door he'd welded shut 23 years ago in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. She died when I was 12, he said, the words coming out rough and unsteady. Cancer. My father, he couldn't handle it, sent me to boarding school while she was still fighting, said it would be better for everyone if I wasn't there to see her suffer. Amelia's hand moved toward him instinctively, then stopped. You didn't get to say goodbye. I got a phone call from a nurse. She'd been asking for me for 3 days. 3 days. His voice cracked on the last word. They said she kept whispering my name, kept asking when I was coming home. But I was 2,000 miles away, learning about proper etiquette and appropriate emotional responses from British boarding school masters who thought tears were weakness. The pain in his voice filled the small apartment like smoke. Amelia could see him now, not the billionaire, not the empire builder, but the 12-year-old boy who'd lost his mother and learned that love meant loss, that caring meant pain, that the safest way to live was to stop feeling altogether. Your father remarried within 6 months, Khalil said bitterly. A younger woman who thought a grieving stepson was inconvenient. I became inconvenient. So I learned to be convenient instead, quiet, successful, profitable. I learned that money could buy distance from pain, that power could build walls high enough to keep out anything that might hurt. And it worked? Khalil looked around her apartment at the photographs that documented relationships he'd never had, at the piano that had been loved enough to keep despite financial hardship, at the woman who'd sacrificed her dreams but never her music. It worked until tonight, he admitted, until you sat at my piano and played like you were talking directly to the part of me I thought I'd killed. Amelia rose from her chair and moved to a shelf where a small photograph sat in a silver frame. She handed it to Khalil, a picture of a younger her with an elegant black woman who shared her features and her radiant smile. My mama before the illness, she said softly. She was a music teacher. Taught me that music wasn't just sound, but conversation, that every song was a bridge between one heart and another. Her voice grew thick with emotion. When she got sick, when the treatments started failing, I stopped playing, couldn't bear the thought of building bridges to nowhere. But tonight I saw someone who needed a bridge more than I needed my fear, she said simply. Someone who'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what connection felt like. Khalil stared at the photograph, seeing the love that radiated between mother and daughter, the kind of uncomplicated affection he'd spent decades convincing himself he didn't need. The donation, he said quietly. The medical fund will save her life. Amelia finished. Why did you do it? Khalil was quiet for a long moment, struggling with truths he'd never spoken aloud. Because he said finally, I couldn't save mine. And maybe if I could save yours, some part of that 12-year-old boy could finally forgive himself for not being there when she needed him. The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning 23 years of grief and guilt and carefully constructed emptiness. Amelia crossed to him slowly, her hand finally completing the gesture she'd started earlier, fingers gentle against his cheek. He leaned into the touch despite himself, starved for human contact that wasn't calculated or purchased or negotiated. She would have forgiven you already, Amelia whispered. Mothers always do. Khalil closed his eyes, and for the first time since he was 12 years old, he let himself cry for the woman who had loved him unconditionally, and the boy who had been too far away to love her back. In that small apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on love rather than money, Khalil al-Rashid began to understand what he had been missing all these years. And Amelia, holding the broken pieces of a man who'd forgotten how to be held, realized that sometimes salvation came in the most unexpected packages, even if that package happened to be worth $12 billion. The tears had dried, leaving behind a strange peace in Amelia's small living room. Khalil sat on her worn sofa, looking oddly at home despite his expensive suit being completely out of place. The walls he'd spent decades building had crumbled in the space of an hour, and instead of feeling exposed, he felt lighter. I should go, he said, but made no move to leave. Should you? Amelia asked, settling into the chair across from him. It's 2 a.m. When was the last time you were awake at 2 a.m. without it being about business? Khalil considered the question. I don't remember. Everything in my life runs on schedules, meetings, optimized sleep patterns. My assistants plan my rest like they plan my acquisitions. That sounds exhausting. It's efficient. That's not the same thing. The gentle correction hung between them, and Khalil found himself smiling, actually smiling for the first time in months. When was the last time someone had corrected him without fear, without calculating the cost of honesty? You're right, he admitted. It's not the same thing at all. Amelia tucked her feet under herself, studying his face in the soft lamplight. Without the harsh confidence of wealth and power, Khalil looked younger, more approachable. The expensive armor had been stripped away, revealing someone she was beginning to genuinely like. Tell me something, she said. When you were little, before everything happened, what did you want to be when you grew up? The question caught him off guard. No one's asked me that in 20 years. I'm asking now. Khalil leaned back against her sofa, his mind traveling to memories he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. An astronaut, he said finally, and then laughed at the absurdity of it. I wanted to build rockets that could take people to Mars. I had notebooks full of designs, calculations I didn't understand but copied from library books. What happened to those notebooks? My father threw them away when I went to boarding school, said they were childish nonsense, that I needed to focus on realistic ambitions. Khalil's voice grew quiet. Realistic meant profitable. Profitable meant safe. Safe meant never reaching for anything that might disappoint you. Amelia nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. My mama used to say that dreams weren't meant to be safe, they were meant to be necessary. Is music necessary for you? As necessary as breathing, she said without hesitation. Even when I couldn't afford to chase it professionally, even when I had to take jobs that made my soul ache, the music never left, it just waited. Khalil gestured toward her grandmother's piano. Would you play something else? Just for me? The request was simple, but the way he asked it, vulnerable, hopeful, almost shy, made Amelia's heart skip. This wasn't the arrogant billionaire demanding entertainment, this was someone asking for a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. What would you like to hear? Something that makes you happy, he said immediately. I realized tonight that I haven't heard happy music in, God, I don't know how long. Everything in my world is either background noise or power anthems designed to motivate productivity. Amelia moved to the piano bench, her fingers finding the keys with familiar ease. "This was my mama's favorite song," she said, beginning to play a gentle, lilting melody. "She used to sing it while she cooked dinner, while she graded her students' papers, while she braided my hair before school." The music that filled the apartment was completely different from the complex, emotionally devastating piece she'd played at the penthouse. This was simple, warm, intimate, like being wrapped in a favorite blanket or held by someone who loved you unconditionally. Khalil closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. He could almost see it, a kitchen filled with the smell of home cooking, a woman humming while she worked, a little girl with pigtails dancing around the table. It was a vision of domestic happiness he'd never experienced, but somehow recognized as everything he'd been missing. "She sounds like she was wonderful," he said when the music faded. "She still is," Amelia corrected gently. "The illness took her strength, but not her spirit. She still hums sometimes, when the pain isn't too bad. The doctors say the experimental treatment might give us more time, real time, not just borrowed days." "Thanks to an anonymous donor," Khalil said quietly. "Thanks to someone who understood that love is worth saving." They looked at each other across the small room, and something shifted between them. The initial antagonism was gone, replaced by recognition, understanding, and something deeper, a fragile but growing connection between two people who had spent years protecting themselves from exactly this kind of vulnerability. "I have a confession," Khalil said. "I've eaten dinner alone every night for the past 3 years. In restaurants that cost more per meal than most people make in a month, surrounded by staff whose job is to anticipate my needs before I voice them. But I've never had anyone make me tea." Amelia smiled, and the expression transformed her face from pretty to radiant. "I have a confession too. I've performed at wedding receptions for couples spending more on flowers than I make in a year. I've played background music while people discuss deals worth millions of dollars, but I've never played for someone who cried." "I don't cry," Khalil protested automatically, then caught himself. "Or rather, I didn't. Until tonight." "How does it feel?" He considered the question seriously. "Terrifying. Liberating. Like I've been holding my breath for 20 years, and finally remembered how to exhale." Amelia rose from the piano bench and moved to the small kitchen. "Are you hungry? I could make something." "It's 2:30 in the morning." So, yes, he admitted. "I'm hungry. I haven't been actually hungry as opposed to eating because my schedule said I should in longer than I can remember." As Amelia rummaged through her modest refrigerator, Khalil found himself studying her movements with fascination. Everything she did was deliberate yet graceful, efficient but unhurried. She moved through her small space like a dancer, every gesture containing its own quiet poetry. "Scrambled eggs and toast," she announced. "Nothing fancy, but it's real food made by real hands. I can't remember the last time someone cooked for me. Really cooked, not just prepared nutrition according to dietary specifications." Amelia laughed, and the sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Well, prepare yourself for disappointment. I'm a much better pianist than I am a chef." But when she set the simple meal in front of him 20 minutes later, Khalil took his first bite and felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the taste of food made with care rather than calculation. He paused, searching for words. "This is the best meal I've had in years." "It's eggs and toast, Khalil." "No," he said firmly. "It's someone giving a damn whether I'm fed or just fueled. There's a difference." They ate in comfortable silence, two people discovering that sharing a simple meal at 3 a.m. could feel more intimate than any five-star dining experience. When they finished, neither wanted to break the spell by acknowledging that morning was coming, that the real world was waiting beyond her apartment door. "Stay," Amelia said quietly, the word slipping out before she could stop it. Khalil's hand stilled on his teacup, Stay. Just until morning. Just to. She struggled with the words, her cheeks flushing. I don't want to be alone right now. And I don't think you do either. The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in its simplicity. Khalil had spent the night in presidential suites and royal palaces, but the thought of sleeping on Amelia's worn sofa felt like the most precious invitation he'd ever received. I'd like that, he said softly. As Amelia brought him a spare blanket and pillow, their hands touched again, just briefly, just skin against skin, but the contact sent electricity through both of them. They were standing close enough that he could smell her shampoo, see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, count the freckles across her nose. Amelia, he whispered. Yes? Thank you. For tonight. For the music. For reminding me that I'm still human. She reached up and touched his cheek again, the gesture that was becoming familiar between them. Thank you for letting me remember why I fell in love with music in the first place. As she disappeared into her bedroom and Khalil settled onto her sofa, both of them understood that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer billionaire and maid, employer and employee, separate worlds forced into temporary collision. They were simply Khalil and Amelia, two damaged people who had found unexpected healing in each other's honesty, two hearts that had been closed for so long they'd forgotten how good it felt to open. And for the first time in decades, neither of them was afraid of what morning might bring. Morning light filtered through Amelia's thin curtains, casting golden squares across the living room where Khalil lay on the sofa, fully dressed but more rested than he'd felt in years. For the first time since childhood, he'd slept without the weight of empire pressing down on his chest, without dreams of boardrooms and balance sheets haunting his unconscious mind. He could hear Amelia moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes and the gentle hum of someone who woke up grateful rather than burdened. The domestic sounds were foreign to him. In his penthouse, an army of invisible staff ensured he never heard the mechanics of daily life, never experienced the small intimacies of morning routine. Good morning. Amelia's voice was soft, respectful of the peace that still lingered from their night of revelations. She appeared in the doorway holding two steaming mugs, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple robe that somehow looked more elegant than any designer gown he'd ever seen. Good morning, he replied, accepting the coffee with hands that remembered the warmth of her touch from hours before. I slept. You sound surprised. I usually don't sleep. I rest efficiently for optimal cognitive function. He took a sip of coffee and smiled ruefully. Everything in my life has been optimized except for actually living it. Amelia settled into her chair, tucking her feet under her in a gesture that was becoming endearingly familiar. In the morning light, she looked younger, more vulnerable, and Khalil felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest, an emotion so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. His phone buzzed against the coffee table where he'd left it the night before. The sound seemed obscenely loud in the gentle morning atmosphere, a harsh reminder of the world waiting outside this small sanctuary they'd created. Hassan's name flashed on the screen, followed immediately by 3 more calls from his executive team, then his lawyer, then his head of security. You should answer it, Amelia said quietly, reading the tension that suddenly radiated from his shoulders. I don't want to. But you're going to. The understanding in her voice was laced with resignation, as if she already knew that morning had brought reality crashing back into their fragile bubble. Khalil answered the phone with reluctance that felt like physical pain. Where the hell are you? Hassan's voice exploded through the speaker before Khalil could even say hello. Your security team has been looking for you all night. Do you have any idea what's happening? I'm fine, Hassan. The Jakarta deal is falling apart. Minister Prawoto is pulling out because some blogger posted a video of last night's party. A video of you being emotionally manipulated by your domestic staff. It's gone viral, Khalil. 3 million views and climbing. Khalil's blood turned to ice. What video? Someone recorded the piano performance. Posted it with the headline, Arab billionaire humiliated by black maid's musical genius. The comments are, they're calling you weak, saying you've lost your edge. Prowoto thinks you're compromised, unstable. Amelia watched Khalil's face transform as Hassan spoke, saw the walls rebuilding themselves in real time. The vulnerable man who had cried in her arms was disappearing, replaced by the cold billionaire who treated emotion like enemy territory. "Send me the link," Khalil said, his voice already hardening. "Khalil, we can fix this. We can spin it, control the narrative, but you need to get back here now. We need to present a united front, show strength." I said, "Send me the link." Hassan's sigh was audible even through the phone. "Check your messages. But Khalil, don't watch it alone. And whatever you do, don't make any decisions while you're emotional." The call ended, leaving behind a silence that felt poisonous compared to the comfortable quiet they'd shared moments before. Khalil's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and Amelia watched his face as he opened the video. She couldn't see the screen, but she could see its effect on him, the way his jaw tightened, his eyes went flat, his entire body seemed to turn to stone. The sound was low, but she caught fragments, her own voice singing the applause that followed, and then worst of all the comments scrolling beneath. "Billionaire gets owned by the help. This is what happens when you hire people who don't know their place. She played him like she played that piano. He looks like he's about to cry, pathetic." Khalil's thumb scrolled through hundreds of similar comments, each one driving the knife deeper. The tender moment they'd shared, the music that had reached through decades of loneliness to touch his heart, had been reduced to entertainment, mockery, viral content for people who saw vulnerability as weakness and connection as exploitation. "Khalil," Amelia said gently, reaching toward him. He jerked away from her touch as if she'd burned him. "Don't. It's just people talking. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter." His voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "I've lost a $2 billion deal because of this. Because I let you." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. "Because you let me what?" Amelia's voice was steady, but Khalil could see the hurt flickering in her eyes. "Because I let you make me forget who I am," he said, standing abruptly, straightening his wrinkled suit like armor. "Because I let sentiment cloud my judgment." Sentiment? The word came out like a slap. "Is that what last night was to you? Sentiment?" Khalil's phone buzzed again, another call from his team, another crisis demanding his attention, another reminder of the world where feelings were liabilities and vulnerability was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Last night was a mistake," he said, the words tasting like acid on his tongue, a momentary lapse in judgment brought on by exhaustion and alcohol. Amelia stood slowly, and Khalil watched her rebuild her own walls in real time. The open, trusting woman who had held him while he cried was disappearing, replaced by someone cooler, more distant. "I see," she said quietly. "And the donation, was that a mistake too?" "The donation was," he struggled with the words, caught between honesty and self-preservation. "The donation was guilt. Nothing more." "Guilt over what, exactly?" "Over letting someone like you get too close to someone like me." The words hung in the air between them like a curse. Amelia's face went carefully blank, but Khalil caught the flinch, the momentary crack in her composure that revealed how deeply he'd wounded her. "Someone like me," she repeated softly. "You mean someone poor, someone black, someone who works for a living instead of inheriting billions." "I mean someone who lives in a different world," Khalil said, but the correction sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You're right," Amelia said, moving to open her apartment door. "We do live in different worlds. In my world, when someone shows you their heart, you don't use it as entertainment for strangers. In my world, when someone trusts you with their pain, you don't call it a mistake the next morning." Khalil walked toward the door, each step feeling like he was walking away from something essential, something he might never find again. But his phone was buzzing incessantly, his empire was crumbling, and the comments on that video were a brutal reminder of what happened when men like him showed weakness. "This is better," he said, not looking at her. "Cleaner, we both knew it couldn't last." "Did we?" Amelia's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because for about 12 hours, I actually believed you were more than just another rich man who thinks poor people exist for his entertainment." Khalil paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to apologize, to fight for what they'd found together, but his phone buzzed again, and Hassan's voice echoed in his memory, "Show strength." "Goodbye, Amelia," he said without turning around. "Goodbye, Mr. Al-Rashid." The formal address hit him like a physical blow, but he forced himself to keep walking. Down 4 flights of stairs, through a lobby that suddenly felt shabby compared to his marble kingdom, into the Dubai morning where his driver waited with the familiar comfort of bulletproof glass and climate-controlled isolation. As the car pulled away from her building, Khalil allowed himself one look back. Amelia stood at her 4th-floor window, still in her robe, watching him leave. Even from a distance, he could see that she was crying. But by the time they reached the first intersection, Khalil had already begun the process of forgetting her, burying their night together beneath layers of business strategy and damage control, convincing himself that walking away was strength, rather than the greatest act of cowardice he'd ever committed. Behind him, in a small apartment that suddenly felt unbearably empty, Amelia closed her curtains against the morning light and finally understood that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. Have you ever walked away from something real because you were afraid of what others might think? Sometimes our greatest regrets come from choosing fear over love. What would you tell someone standing at that crossroads? Khalil threw himself into damage control with the desperate energy of a man trying to outrun his own conscience. Emergency board meetings, crisis management sessions, calls to ministers and moguls, anything to avoid the silence where Amelia's voice still echoed, where the memory of her tears burned like acid in his chest. The Jakarta deal was salvageable, Hassan assured him. Minister Prawoto could be convinced that the viral video was a momentary aberration, not a sign of weakness. All it required was a show of strength, a demonstration that Khalil al-Rashid remained the ruthless businessman who had built an empire from ambition and ice. "Schedule the press conference for tomorrow," Khalil instructed his communications team from behind his desk, Dubai's skyline sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. "I want to address the rumors directly." "What's our angle?" his PR director asked, fingers poised over her tablet. "That the video was taken out of context, that I was evaluating a potential acquisition in the entertainment sector, that the employee in question was auditioning for a subsidiary company we're considering purchasing." The lies came easily, smoothly constructed to transform his most honest moment into just another business transaction. But even as he spoke them, Khalil felt something vital dying inside his chest. His phone buzzed with a text from Hassan. "Saw the medical fund payment, $500K for emergency employee expenses. Creative accounting for your guilty conscience?" Khalil stared at the message, remembering Amelia's face when she'd spoken about her mother, the way hope had flickered in her eyes when she mentioned the experimental treatment. At least that part hadn't been a lie. Whatever else he'd destroyed, he'd saved one life. It felt like the smallest possible redemption. Meanwhile, 23 floors below, Amelia sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching the experimental treatment work its quiet miracle. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, the cancer markers were dropping, her mother's strength was returning, and for the first time in months, they were talking about remission instead of managing decline. "You're not happy," her mother observed, studying Amelia's face with the penetrating insight that serious illness sometimes brought. "The treatment is working, baby girl. Why do you look like you're grieving?" Amelia smoothed her mother's blanket with hands that still remembered the weight of piano keys, still carried the muscle memory of music that had changed everything and nothing. I'm happy about you, Mama. More happy than I know how to express. But, but I think I made a mistake. A big one. Her mother's hand found hers, still weak but warm with life, that might have been lost without an anonymous donor's generosity. Tell me. So Amelia told her about the party, the challenge, the music that had poured out of her like prayer. About the man who had cried at her piano, who had slept on her sofa, who had eaten her simple breakfast like it was a feast. About the video that had turned their moment of connection into viral entertainment, and the morning when he'd looked at her like she was a mistake he needed to correct. He called it sentiment. Amelia finished, her voice barely audible, said I was someone from a different world who got too close. Her mother was quiet for a long moment, processing the story with the careful consideration of someone who had learned to measure words like medicine. What do you think it was? She asked finally. I think, Amelia struggled with the truth, with admitting how deeply she'd been affected by one night of honest connection. I think for 12 hours, I forgot that fairy tales don't happen to people like us. That billionaires don't fall for maids, that powerful men don't change their entire worldview because of one song. Maybe they don't, her mother agreed gently, but maybe this one did. Maybe he's sitting in his tower right now, trying just as hard to convince himself it was all sentiment. Mama, you didn't see his face when he left. You didn't hear how cold his voice got. Baby girl, I've been sick for 2 years. You know what I've learned about fear? It makes people say terrible things to protect themselves from hope. Sometimes the cruelest words come from the most frightened hearts. Amelia wanted to believe her mother's wisdom, but the memory of Khalil's dismissal was too fresh, too sharp. She'd opened her heart completely, had offered him the most precious gift she possessed, her music, her vulnerability, her trust. And he'd reduced it all to a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment. Even if you're right, she said. Even if he's scared, what does that change? He made his choice. He chose his world over whatever we might have had. Her mother squeezed her hand with surprising strength. Then maybe it's time for you to make yours. High above the city, Khalil stood in his study staring at the Steinway that had remained silent since Amelia's performance 3 nights ago. His housekeeper had offered to have it moved, sensing his discomfort with its presence, but he'd declined. Some part of him needed it there, a $3 million reminder of the most expensive lesson he'd ever learned. His laptop was open to the press release his team had prepared, the carefully crafted lies that would restore his reputation and rebuild the walls that one woman's music had so effortlessly demolished. All he had to do was approve it, hold the press conference, and bury the memory of scrambled eggs and tea made with hands that loved him. His phone rang. Hassan's name appeared on the screen. The press conference is set for noon tomorrow, Hassan said without preamble. Jakarta is back on the table, Proroto is satisfied with the official narrative, and the viral video is already being forgotten. Another week and this will all be background noise. Good, Khalil said automatically. Is it? Because you sound like a man who's won everything and lost his soul. The observation hit too close to home. Hassan. I've known you for 15 years, Khalil. I watched you build this empire, watched you turn yourself into a machine that generates profit instead of a person who experiences life. But 3 nights ago, for about 10 minutes, I saw you become human again. Being human is a luxury I can't afford. Says who? Your father? The boarding school masters who taught you that feelings were weakness? Or are you so scared of being hurt again that you'd rather die rich and empty than live poor and full? Khalil closed his eyes, Hassan's words echoing the accusations his own heart had been whispering for 3 sleepless days. She's not poor anymore, Hassan continued quietly. The medical fund donation, I know where it went. Her mother's treatment is fully covered. So what's your excuse now? That she's not sophisticated enough for your world? That she doesn't understand power and money? She doesn't. No, she doesn't. She understands something better. She understands what it means to love someone more than you love yourself. When was the last time anyone loved you like that? Khalil, when was the last time you loved anyone like that? The questions hung in the air like challenges. Khalil thought of his mother's hand in his, of her voice calling his name in a hospital room he'd been too far away to hear. He thought of 23 years of building walls so high he'd forgotten what existed beyond them. "It's too late," he said, finally. "I burned that bridge, called her a mistake, dismissed what we had as sentiment. She'll never forgive me." "Maybe not," Hassan agreed. "But that's her choice to make. Yours is simpler. Do you want to spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been, or do you want to find out if love is worth more than pride?" After Hassan hung up, Khalil stood alone in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his success and the silence of his isolation. The press release glowed on his laptop screen, a document that would restore his reputation and guarantee his loneliness. On his desk lay a single sheet of paper, Amelia's employment file, which included her personal information, her address, where he'd spent the most honest night of his adult life, her phone number, which he'd memorized but never called. The choice was simple, Hassan had said, but as Khalil stared at that piece of paper, it felt like the most complicated decision he'd ever faced. Choose safety and lose everything that mattered. Choose love and risk everything he'd built. His hand moved toward the phone. The choice came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, 13 minutes before Khalil would have to choose between sleep and another sleepless vigil with his ghosts. He picked up the phone. Her number was burned into his memory from reading her employment file, but his fingers trembled as he dialed. 3 rings, 4. He was preparing to hang up when her voice came through the speaker, cautious and tired. "Hello? Amelia." Her name felt like coming home. "It's me." A long pause. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "Mr. Al-Rashid, it's late. I know. I couldn't sleep. I'm sorry to hear that. Perhaps your doctor could prescribe something." The polite distance in her voice was worse than anger would have been. She was treating him like a stranger, like someone who had never slept on her sofa, or cried against her shoulder, or eaten breakfast made by hands that loved him. "Amelia, please. I need to see you. I don't think that's wise. I know I hurt you. I know I said terrible things." "You said honest things," she interrupted, her voice steady but tired. "You told me the truth about how you see me, about what our different worlds mean. I should thank you for your honesty." "It wasn't honest," Khalil said desperately. "It was fear. It was cowardice. It was me choosing the easy path instead of—" "Instead of what? Instead of pretending we could be something we're not? Instead of ignoring that you're worth $12 billion and I just lost my job as a maid? Instead of fighting for something real?" The words hung between them through the phone connection, bridging the miles between his penthouse and her apartment, between his world of marble and gold and her world of love and music. "Real," Amelia repeated softly. "You called it sentiment, a mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment." "I lied." "Which time?" The question hit like a physical blow. Khalil closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the cool glass of his window, and spoke the truth that had been burning holes in his chest for 3 days. "When I walked away from you, I lied. When I said it was sentiment, I lied. When I told myself I could go back to my old life and pretend you never existed, I lied." His voice broke on the last word. "The only honest thing I've said in 3 days is that I can't sleep, can't eat, can't breathe without thinking about you." Silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of words that couldn't be taken back, choices that couldn't be unmade. "Your press conference is tomorrow," Amelia said finally. "I saw the announcement. You're going to explain that I was just auditioning for one of your companies, that the viral video was taken out of context. I'm not holding the press conference." "What?" "I canceled it 20 minutes ago, called my PR team, told them I was taking a different approach." "Khalil, you'll lose the Jakarta deal," Hassan said. How do you know what Hassan said? Another pause. He called me. This afternoon. He wanted me to know that you were destroying your reputation for pride. He thought I should understand what my rejection was costing you. Khalil's grip tightened on the phone. And what did you tell him? I told him that you made your choice when you walked out of my apartment calling me a mistake. Her voice softened slightly. But Hassan said something else. He said you'd been carrying your mother's death like a stone in your chest for 23 years, and that one night of music had finally helped you set it down. He said maybe I was the only person who could help you learn to live without that weight. He's right, Khalil whispered. You are. Khalil. Marry me. The words escaped before he could stop them, raw and desperate and completely unplanned. The silence that followed felt like falling. What did you just say? Marry me, he repeated, the words gaining strength as he spoke them. I know it's insane. I know we've known each other for 4 days. I know I'm $12 billion and you're… Careful. Amelia's voice carried a warning. You're everything I never knew I needed, he finished softly. Your music and warmth and honesty and home. You're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen someone worth loving instead of someone worth using. Khalil, you can't just… People don't fall in love in one night? People don't know their hearts in 4 days? People don't rebuild their entire understanding of what matters because someone played piano like they were saving souls. Amelia was quiet for so long that Khalil wondered if the connection had failed. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. I can't marry someone who's ashamed of me. I was never ashamed of you, Khalil said fiercely. I was ashamed of myself, ashamed that I'd become the kind of man who measured worth in dollars instead of depth, who built walls so high I'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone climb them. The video shows exactly what happened. It shows a man who'd forgotten how to feel falling in love with the woman who reminded him how to be human, and tomorrow, instead of a press conference full of lies, I'm going to release a statement saying exactly that. You'll destroy your reputation. My reputation was built on being untouchable, unemotional, inhuman. Maybe it's time to build something better. Through the phone, Khalil could hear Amelia crying, not the bitter tears of hurt, but something softer, more hopeful. This is crazy, she whispered. The craziest thing I've ever done, he agreed. Also the sanest. I don't know how to be a billionaire's wife. I don't know how to be a husband. We'll figure it out together. Another long pause, then ask me again. What? Ask me again. Properly this time. Not over the phone, not because you're scared and desperate. Ask me when you're sure, when you're ready to mean it with your whole heart. Khalil was already moving, grabbing his keys, his wallet, his heart that suddenly felt too big for his chest. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Khalil, 18 minutes. I'm leaving now. The drive through Dubai's late-night streets passed in a blur of possibility and terror. At every red light, Khalil questioned his sanity. At every green light, he pressed the accelerator and refused to doubt. He took the stairs to her apartment 3 at a time, arriving breathless and disheveled, and more alive than he'd felt in decades. When Amelia opened her door, she was wearing the same simple robe from their first morning together, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes bright with tears and hope in equal measure. Without a word, Khalil dropped to one knee in her doorway. Amelia Johnson, he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I don't have a ring. I don't have a plan. I don't have anything except the absolute certainty that I want to spend the rest of my life learning how to love you the way you deserve to be loved. She covered her mouth with her hands, tears spilling over her fingers. I want to wake up to your music every morning, he continued. I want to eat scrambled eggs made by hands that chose to love me. I want to build a life where wealth is measured in laughter and success is counted in moments of connection. Khalil. I want to take you to see your mother every day until the treatment makes her completely well, and then I want to take you both to see the world, not from penthouse suites and private jets, but from wherever music lives, wherever love grows, wherever you want to plant roots." Amelia knelt down until they were at eye level, her hands framing his face, like she had that first night when he'd finally learned to cry. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "Really, truly sure." "I've never been sure of anything in my life," Khalil admitted. "Except this. Except you. Except us." "Then yes," she breathed against his lips. "Yes, yes, yes." When they kissed in her doorway, 24 floors above the city that had brought them together, it felt like coming home and starting an adventure all at once. It tasted like promises and possibility, like music made flesh, like love that had been worth waiting 35 years to find. 6 months later, Amelia Al-Rashid stood on the stage of Dubai's Opera House, her husband watching from the front row as she performed her debut concert as the city's newest artist-in-residence. The program was simple, classical pieces interwoven with original compositions, music that told the story of two people who had found each other across impossible odds. The final piece was the song she'd played that first night in his penthouse, the melody that had cracked open his heart and changed both their lives forever. But tonight it wasn't a song of longing and loss, it was a song of gratitude, of love found and kept and treasured. As the last note faded, and the audience erupted in applause, Khalil rose from his seat, tears streaming down his face with no shame, no fear, no walls between his heart and the world. "I love you," he mouthed across the distance between stage and seat. "I love you too," she mouthed back, her hands finding her heart and then reaching toward him, the universal language they'd been speaking since the night she'd reminded him how to feel. Later, as they walked hand in hand through Dubai's glittering streets toward the home they'd built together, not a penthouse kingdom, but a real house with a garden where her mother tended flowers and rooms filled with laughter instead of emptiness, Khalil marveled at how completely his life had transformed. He still owned companies, still moved in circles of power and wealth, but now those things served a purpose beyond accumulation. They were tools for building something better, platforms for lifting others, resources for ensuring that love could flourish wherever it was found. "Any regrets?" Amelia asked, swinging their joined hands between them like teenagers discovering first love. Khalil considered the question seriously, thinking of everything he'd gained and everything he'd willingly lost, the fear, the isolation, the empty safety of walls too high to climb. "Just one," he said finally. Amelia's steps faltered. "What?" "I regret that it took me 35 years to find you," Khalil said, pulling her close under a streetlight that painted them both in golden warmth. "I regret every day I lived without your music, every night I slept without your love, every morning I woke up alone when I could have been waking up beside you. We found each other when we were ready," Amelia said wisely. "Any sooner, and we might not have recognized what we were looking at." "Maybe," Khalil agreed, spinning her around under the streetlight like they were dancing to music only they could hear, "but I'm glad we'll never have to find out." As they walked the rest of the way home to their house, their life, their love that had started with 10 minutes of music and would last for all the years to come, both of them understood that some stories don't end. They just begin.
What moment in your life changed everything? Sometimes love finds us in the most unexpected ways, through the most unlikely people. Share your story of unexpected love or transformation. We believe everyone has a moment when music, in whatever form it takes, saved their soul. If this love story touched your heart, wait until you experience our next tale of impossible romance and life-changing music. It's even more dramatic, more emotional, and more unbelievable than Khalil and Amelia's journey. Don't miss it. Click the video appearing on your screen now to dive into another world where love conquers all. Thank you for staying with us until the very last note.